She wanted the boys to have everything. Paul Burrell said those words under oath. At the inquest. In a courtroom, with lawyers from every side pressing him for detail. He was talking about Diana's instructions for her personal belongings, the things she had accumulated across 17 years inside the most jeweled family in the world, the things she had worn on her wedding day, the things she had worn at state dinners, the things she had worn the night she danced with John Travolta at the White House, the night she held a dying child in Calcutta, the night she sat across from Martin Bashir and told 23 million people the truth about her marriage. She wanted the boys to have everything. That was the instruction. Clear. Simple. The kind of instruction that leaves no room for interpretation if the people around you are inclined to honor it. They were not all so inclined. What happened to Diana's jewelry in the years after her death? The pieces the Queen had given her. The pieces the royal family had loaned her. The pieces that had been placed in her hands on the morning of July 29, 1981, and had defined the visual image of the most photographed woman on Earth for 17 years, is one of the least examined chapters in the entire Diana story. It happens in the quiet, in the institutional space between grief and administration, where things get decided without announcements and moved without ceremony, and by the time anyone thinks to ask, the answer has already been arranged. And at the center of it, in the years that followed, was a woman the Queen had called a wicked woman, a woman the Queen had banned from her presence, a woman who had spent 8 years being kept out of every room the institution controlled, until gradually and then completely she wasn't. This is that story. It comes from Paul Burrell's testimony at the 2008 inquest and his memoir A Royal Duty. From Prince Harry's account in Spare, which is the most detailed first-person record of what the Wales boys believed about their mother's belongings. From biographers Sally Bedell-Smith, Tina Brown, and Tom Bower, who between them spent decades interviewing the people closest to this family. From the documented public record of what Camilla was seen wearing in the years after 2005, and the public reaction to it. Where the record is clear, I'll tell you it's clear. Where it is disputed, I'll tell you that too. This channel does not deal in fabrication, but it does deal in the full truth of what is documented. And what is documented is extraordinary enough. Before we go further, if this channel has ever shown you a Diana that felt real, take 1 second and subscribe. This one has been a long time coming. Let's start where the jewelry started, not with the death, with the wedding. July 29, 1981, the morning of the wedding, Kensington Palace, then St. James's Palace, then the carriage, then St. Paul's Cathedral and 750 million people watching. Before any of that, before the dress, before the veil, before the 25-foot train that took 5 bridesmaids to carry, Diana was given jewels, the Spencer family tiara first, on loan from her own family, the piece she wore in the carriage with the veil pinned beneath it, and then the pieces from the royal family. The Queen and the Queen Mother began presenting Diana with jewelry from the royal collection shortly before and after the wedding. Not loans in the ordinary sense, gifts. Given to the new Princess of Wales as she took her place in the family. Given to mark her entry into a world that was built, in part, on the visual language of diamonds and pearls and the weight of history on a woman's collarbone. Over the years, the pieces accumulated. The Cambridge Lover's Knot Tiara, a piece originally made for Queen Mary in 1914, given to Diana by the Queen. Diana wore it so often, and made it so entirely her own, that most people who know it as Diana's tiara. She wore it at state banquets. She wore it to the opera. She wore it in the photographs that became icons. There were pearl chokers, sapphire sweets, the Spencer family pearl drop earrings, the aquamarine ring she was photographed wearing in the final months of her life, bought for herself at auction. The pieces told the whole story of her public life if you knew how to read them. After the separation in 1992, the question of which jewels were loans from the royal collection and which were Diana's outright personal property became part of the legal and institutional negotiations that surrounded the divorce. Some pieces went back. Some stayed with Diana. Some existed in a grey space where the answer depended on who was asking and when. When Diana died on August 31st, 1997, the question of her personal jewelry became urgent in the way that all questions about a person's belongings become urgent when they die suddenly, abroad, in circumstances that nobody planned for. And the instruction she had left was clear. Burrell testified to it. She wanted the boys to have everything. Paul Burrell was Diana's butler for 10 years. He was, in his own words and in the words of the people around Diana, her rock. the man she trusted with the practical architecture of her private life, the candlelit dinners for Hasnat Khan, that the chef was told nothing about, the smuggling of Khan through the palace gates in the boot of the car, the letters she asked him to keep safe, the conversations he was present for that nobody else was present for. When Diana died in Paris, Burrell went to Kensington Palace and began, in a state of shock and grief, to gather the things he felt needed to be secured. He has described this in his memoir and in testimony. He took items he felt were personal, private, and in need of protection. He did it unilaterally, without instructions, out of a combination of grief and loyalty and an instinct that the institution was going to move quickly and that Diana's private things needed someone to stand between them and the machine. He was later arrested and charged with theft. The trial collapsed in November 2002 when the Queen intervened. She told her advisers she had a recollection of a conversation with Burrell in which he told her he was taking items for safekeeping. The charges were dropped. The establishment closed around the case in the way the establishment closes around things it does not want examined. What emerged from the wreckage of that trial was a picture of the weeks and months after Diana's death as a period of significant institutional activity around her personal effects. Things were assessed, things were catalogued, things were returned to the royal collection that had originally come from the royal collection. Among those things were jewels, the Cambridge lover's knot tiara, the piece Diana had worn more than almost any other, the piece most associated with her public image, went back to the Queen. It sat in storage for years. Elizabeth did not wear it. It was not loaned to anyone publicly for a long time. It sat in the vault, and then eventually it was given to Catherine, Princess of Wales, Diana's daughter-in-law, the woman who married her eldest son. That particular story has a clean ending that the public received warmly. The tiara back on the head of the Princess of Wales, worn by a woman Diana's son chose, connecting the generations in a way that felt like continuity rather than erasure. But that is not the jewellery story that shocked everyone. That is not the chapter the public was not prepared for. April 9, 2005. Windsor Guildhall. Charles and Camilla were married in a civil ceremony in the presence of their immediate families and a small gathering of close friends. The Queen, who had given her consent for the marriage, did not attend the ceremony itself. She came to the blessing at Windsor Castle afterward. Camilla wore a gold silk basket weave coat and a Philip Treacy hat. She was 57 years old. She had waited, in various forms of patience and seclusion, for 35 years for this day, and on her wrist was a bracelet. Not a new piece, not something bought for the occasion, a piece from the royal collection, one that had previously been worn by Diana, a piece that had been part of the visual language of the most photographed marriage of the 20th century, now photographed on the wrist of the woman whose presence in that marriage had been one of its defining catastrophes. The reaction online and in the press, when royal watchers began identifying and cataloguing what Camilla was wearing in the years after the marriage, was not quiet. It built slowly, as these things do, through the work of people who track royal jewellery with the obsessive precision of archivists, cross-referencing photographs, identifying stones, tracing provenance. What they documented, piece by piece across the years, was a pattern of royal jewels that had been associated with Diana appearing at official engagements in Camilla's possession. The Spencer tiara itself never went to Camilla. That belonged to the Spencer family, not the royal collection, and it passed according to the family's own wishes. But pieces from the royal collection that Diana had worn, pieces loaned to her, given to her, associated in the public mind entirely with her, did find their way into Camilla's jewel box. Not stolen, not taken in any criminal sense, allocated, redistributed, moved through the institutional channels that control such things without announcement or explanation. The public was not asked. No announcement was made. The pieces simply appeared at a state dinner here, a royal engagement there, on the woman who had been called a wicked woman by the Queen less than a decade before, on the woman who had not been allowed in the same room as the royal family for years after Diana's death, on the woman William and Harry had watched from childhood occupy the space where their parents' marriage had been. In January 2023, Prince Harry published Spare. It was the most detailed first-person account any member of the royal family had ever given of the internal life of the institution, and it landed with the force of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. Harry wrote about his mother's jewellery, not in passing. In terms that made clear this was not a small thing to him or to William, he described the sense, accumulated over years, that the things Diana had left, the things she had wanted the boys to have had not always found their way to them, that the institution had its own logic for the allocation of royal possessions, and that logic did not always align with the instructions of a woman who was no longer alive to enforce them. He wrote about specific pieces. He wrote about the feeling of seeing jewels associated with his mother appearing elsewhere. He wrote about what that felt like from inside a grief that had never been properly processed, the grief of two boys who lost their mother at 12 and 15, and were then asked to walk behind her coffin in public and hold their faces still. The institution's response to spare was the institution's standard response to things it does not want examined. It said nothing official and briefed extensively off the record. But Harry had said it, in his own name, in print, for the record. The boys had been told she wanted them to have everything, and the everything had not always arrived. Here is the part that shocked everyone. Not the jewelry itself, not the pieces identified by royal watchers in photographs, not even Harry's account in spare, devastating as it was. What shocked everyone was the normalization. Camilla had spent 8 years as the woman the Queen would not have in her presence. The woman banned from royal functions. The woman Charles's siblings refused to share a birthday party with. The woman the Queen Mother would not allow to be mentioned by name. She had been, in the institutional language of the family, someone who existed outside the circle. And then, step by step, she was inside it. The 2000 party where she and the Queen were finally in the same room. The 2005 marriage. The 2022 Platinum Jubilee statement in which Elizabeth said she wanted Camilla known as Queen Consort. The 2023 coronation in Westminster Abbey, the same space where Diana's coffin had rested, where Camilla was crowned beside Charles. The woman the Queen had called a wicked woman was now the Queen, and the things that had belonged to Diana, the visual language of her life, the pieces placed in her hands before she understood what she was walking into, the jewels she wore through the AIDS wards and the landmine fields, and the quiet Tuesday evenings when she was just a woman in a dark wig walking through Chelsea, trying to live like a person. Those things were now part of the wardrobe of the woman who replaced her. The public saw it happen, not in a single moment. In the accumulated weight of photograph after photograph after photograph, the same stones, different neck, the same settings, different wrist, the same tiaras, different woman. They didn't scream about it. They didn't riot. They did something more British and more permanent. They remembered. They catalogued. They posted side-by-side comparisons in the comment sections of photographs, and they did not forget what they were looking at. Diana had said, years before she died, that she knew she would never be queen. She said it on the Morton tapes. She said it without self-pity, which was one of the most remarkable things about her. She understood the institutional arithmetic. She understood that the fairy tale had its own logic and its own ending, and she was not going to be the one who sat in the chair at the end of it. She was right. She never sat in the chair, but she also never imagined, and this is the detail that sits differently when you let it, that the woman who wore the crown in her place would be wearing her jewels to do it. The institution has never explained the jewelry decisions. That's not how the institution works. It does not explain allocations. It does not issue inventories. It does not send press releases about which pieces from the royal collection have been loaned or given or moved from one person's possession to another's. The decisions happen in rooms that have no public record. They are made by people whose job is the management of the monarchy's assets and the monarchy's image simultaneously. And the image considerations in this case were enormous because every piece associated with Diana carried Diana with it. Every photograph of Camilla, wearing a piece the public remembered from Diana's wrists or ears or throat, was a photograph that the royal watchers would compare. That was always going to happen. The institution knew it was always going to happen. It happened anyway. William has been careful. He has not spoken publicly in the specific terms Harry used in Spare, but those who know him well have described a man who carries his mother's memory in a particular and private way, and who has been at various points quietly and firmly protective of what he believes was hers. Catherine wearing the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara was not an accident or an oversight. It was a choice, a signal, deliberate and legible to anyone who understood the language being spoken, that certain things were going to stay in a particular line. Harry said it more directly, in Spare, in his own voice, in the account that cannot be unpublished. She wanted the boys to have everything, not stolen, not taken in any criminal sense, allocated, redistributed, moved through the channels that control such things, by the people whose job it is to control such things, without a word of public explanation. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, made for Queen Mary in 1914, given to Diana by the Queen, worn by Diana so often and so memorably that most people alive today know it as Diana's tiara, had gone back to the royal collection after Diana's death. It sat in a vault. Elizabeth did not wear it publicly. For years it was simply absent, stored away in the silence that the institution uses as a management tool. Eventually it went to Catherine, Diana's daughter-in-law, the woman William chose. That particular transfer the public received as continuity, the tiara back on a Princess of Wales, worn by the woman Diana's son loves, connecting generations in a way that felt like tribute rather than erasure. But other pieces moved differently. Other pieces appeared on Camilla, and those appearances, quiet, cumulative, documented in side-by-side photographs that nobody in the palace had commissioned or approved, told a story the institution had not intended to tell. The public saw it. They didn't riot, they didn't march. They did something more durable. They remembered. They posted the comparisons. They looked at the same stones on different necks, and they held it in the particular way that people hold things they were never given a proper explanation for. Harry said it plainly. In January 2023, in Spare, the most detailed first-person account any member of the royal family has ever put into print, he wrote about his mother's belongings, about the sense that had accumulated over years, the feeling that the things Diana had left, the things she had specifically wanted the boys to have, had not always found their way to them, that the institution had its own logic for these decisions, and that logic did not always align with the instructions of a woman who was no longer alive to enforce them. He wrote it in his own name, in print. For the permanent record, the institution said nothing officially. It briefed extensively off the record, the way it always does when something inconvenient reaches the light. The briefings were not about the substance of what Harry had said. They were about Harry, his motives, his reliability, his relationship with the family. The substance was left unaddressed. The jewelry decisions were never explained. They still haven't been. What shocked everyone was not any single piece. It was the arc, the full shape of what happened, traced from beginning to end, which nobody had been meant to see all at once. Camilla had spent 8 years as the woman the Queen would not have in her presence, the woman banned from royal functions, the woman Charles's siblings refused to share a birthday party with, the woman the Queen mother would not allow to be mentioned by name in her presence, the woman the Queen herself had called, in a private room at Balmoral with nobody else listening, a wicked woman. And then, step by step, she was inside everything. The 2000 party where she and the Queen were finally in the same room. The 2005 marriage at Windsor Guildhall, which the Queen did not attend but did not block. The 2022 Platinum Jubilee statement, in which Elizabeth, the woman who had said, "I want nothing to do with her," wrote publicly that she wished Camilla to be known as Queen Consort. The 2023 coronation in Westminster Abbey, the same space where Diana's coffin had rested on a September morning in 1997, while 1 billion people watched in silence, where Camilla was crowned beside Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury placed a crown on her head. The woman the Queen called wicked was now the Queen, and the jewels that had been Diana's, the visual language of her life, the pieces placed in her hands before she fully understood what she was walking into, were now part of the wardrobe of the woman who replaced her. Diana had said it herself, on the Morton tapes, without self-pity. She knew she would never be queen. She understood the institutional arithmetic. The fairy tale had its own ending, and she was not going to be sitting in the chair at the end of it. She was right. She never sat in the chair, but she never imagined, and this is the detail that changes the whole picture when you hold it clearly, that the woman who wore the crown in her place would be photographed doing it in her stones. Paul Burrell said she wanted the boys to have everything. That was the instruction. That was what she left behind, in the only form available to her. The spoken word, the private understanding, the trust placed in the people who said they loved her. Some of it reached them. William has Catherine wearing the lover's knot at state occasions, which is its own kind of answer, a deliberate and legible signal that certain things were going to stay in a particular line. Harry has his account in print, which cannot be taken back, or archived away, or managed into silence by a palace briefing. But some of it went elsewhere, through the quiet channels, into the vaults and out again on different occasions, photographed by cameras that recorded everything without understanding half of what they were looking at. She wanted the boys to have everything. The everything did not all arrive. And the people who watched, who catalogued and compared and posted the side-by-side photographs and never stopped paying attention. They understood what they were looking at, even when nobody official said a word about it. They always do, when it comes to Diana. They always have. That is perhaps the one thing the institution never fully calculated, that the most watched woman in the world would go on being watched, that every object associated with her would carry her into every room it entered, that the jewels would keep telling the story long after the people who moved them had stopped thinking about the story they were telling. She tilted her head. The tiara held. She walked out into the light. And the light never quite went out. Thank you for staying with me through this one. The jewelry is never really about the jewelry. It never is, with Diana. It's about what the objects meant to her. To the boys she wanted to have everything. To the people who watched from outside the palace gates and knew, without being told, what they were seeing when those pieces appeared elsewhere. Objects carry the people who wore them. That's what makes them matter. And that's what makes this story quiet and institutional and played out in the language of photographs rather than courtrooms, one of the ones that sits with you. She wore those pieces into every room she ever walked into, and the rooms are still showing them off.